All right. Hello and welcome. It is February 6th, 2024. And today I want to talk about the bean family, the family Fabaceae, also known as Leguminosae. And this is a large plant family that also has a lot of deep relationships with humankind and human cultures. First, I want to talk a little bit about um, what's going on right now in the plant world outside. And one of the things that is going on is that as the days are getting longer, more stuff is starting to bloom. It's continuing the trend from last week. Um, some of the trees, like maple trees, are starting to have buds on their branches, starting to grow a little bit. Some of the winter annuals, which would include lamium and cardamine, if you're in town or in largely disturbed human inhabited areas, are starting to put out small amounts of flowers. They're not in full bloom yet, but you'll see a flower here and there on some of the lamium plants, some of the dead nettle plants. And in a matter of a few weeks, you'll be able to drive down the road and see places where plowed fields are completely overgrown and look like just a field of purple flowers or just a purple lawn. But we're not to that point at all yet. Just the occasional flower here and there to tempt the occasional early emerging insect. And things are trending in that direction. Also, if you look at the sycamore trees, they're starting to release their balls of fluff more and more. And so those balls that have been hanging from the trees of their seeds for weeks and weeks now are starting to break up and disperse in the form of little balls of fluff. So a lot going on out there in the world. It's just kind of, it's gone from sleeping to softly creeping, and then it will go into leaping in March and early April. So the family of plants that I want to talk about today are the bean plants. These are a family of plants that have a distinctive shaped flower and fruit that is their main defining characteristic. A lot of them also have compound leaves where where each leaf is made up of multiple leaflets. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of plants in this family. And if you've ever grown peas or beans, you've probably seen some things like this, that this might look kind of similar to. So I'm going to just pull up a couple of photos to share. So this one is called partridge pea. It has a large yellow flower, and because of the direction of the flowers and the fact that the petals are kind of flapping around in the wind as I take this picture, you can't really see the shape of the flower so well. But if you look at the leaves, you can see that each leaf has a central midrib, and from that you have a bunch of little leaflets, arranged in almost a fern type of shape. And they're opposite one another across that central stem. And each of those fern-like structures is one leaf. And each of the little tiny things is a leaflet. And if you look, you can also see that this has little beans on it. And that is the shape of a lot of the fruits in this family. They look like little tiny beans. Some of them look a little bit different because they only have one or two seeds in them, but they still have the same basic structure of having that outer pod with a seed or seeds, often many seeds in a row, inside of it. So if you know what beans look like, and you see something that looks a lot like a bean on a plant, there's a good chance it's in this family. Now, there are certain things that we call beans sometimes that are not members of the bean family. To give an example, vanilla beans. And if you look at this fruit and you think about what it looks like compared to what a vanilla bean looks like, vanilla bean is cylindrical and it has sort of creases that run the length of it. With these, you can really kind of see the shape of the seed through the pod, and they're either flat or kind of short and stubby and chubby, but they're not cylindrical. So vanilla is actually an orchid, and it has a seed pod that's longer than it is wide, but it's not a bean. The same is true with coffee. Coffee actually has a berry, and inside that berry, there's two little seeds, and the seeds kind of face each other, and the side of the seeds that face the other seed is flat, and so that gives it that familiar shape. But really, those are two seeds from inside of a berry. And even though the individual seeds look a little bit reminiscent of a bean, a shelled bean, they're not actually beans. But whenever you see this kind of long, flat pod that looks a lot like a bean that someone might grow in their garden, like a string bean or a sugar snap pea, then that is in the bean family. That is in the Fabaceae family, which is also, especially in older writings, called the Leguminosae family. So Leguminosae means that they have legumes, which are these kinds of structures, these kinds of fruits. Peas, beans, peanuts, lentils are all legumes, and they all come in something shaped kind of like this. Fabaceae means that it is similar to faba. Faba, broad beans, is the type species, and all the other species in the family are defined by how closely related they are to that individual plant. So I'm going to show you another example, a different plant in this family. This one is a wild licorice. This is Glycyrrhiza lepiota, which is an American licorice plant, a native species of licorice that grows here. Doesn't have nearly as strong of a licoricey flavor as the conventional licorice. You can see that the shape of the leaves, the compound leaves, is fairly similar, and the cluster of flowers is also fairly typical. Seeing a group of flowers like this is fairly typical for plants in this family. You might also think of honey locust trees, if you know what they look like. They have very similar leaves, very similar flowers. They are also members of this family. They also bear beans, just like this one does, as the fruit, bean pods. So even though one of them is a very tiny herb and one of them is a very large tree, they are actually part of the same family, and they share a lot of the same features and the same structures, same patterns and geometry. One more that I want to show you that's a little bit different, but also a very familiar plant, is clover. This one's red clover. There are a bunch of different species of clover. Trifolium is the species because each compound leaf is made up of usually three leaflets. As you know, there are 4-leaf clovers as well, but the normal number is 3. And it's got this same shape of flower that we saw on the licorice. They're arranged differently. The flower head is more of a little ball, but the shape of the flower itself is pretty similar. White and pinkish and yellow are very common flower colors in this family. I mean, those are very common flower colors in general, but those are the flower colors you tend to see in this family. So red clover is another example of a plant that is in the bean family. Besides these plants, we have some food crops, all the garbanzo beans, green beans, sugar snap peas. In Malaysia, there are there's a plant called the ice cream plant that has beans that are about 3 feet long, 4 feet long, size of a good sized log, but they look just like beans. And if you break them open, there's some edible stuff around each seed. Some bean plants are vines. There are quite a few plants that are kind of creeping ground covers or vines, like the vetches. A lot of string beans, pole beans have a viney type of tendrily growth habit as well, climbing with little tendrils that hold on to things. The clovers are mostly grown by people for a couple of reasons. One reason is as food for bees, and white clover, which is very common in lawns, was actually brought to this country as specifically as forage for bees, something that would grow much of the year, flower much of the year, and give some food to honeybees. So when people brought honeybees over, they brought white clover from Northern Europe over with it. Red clover was also brought over by people, mainly as pasture for livestock, for grazing animals like cows. And the thing about that is that it contains quite a bit of protein, and also it enriches the soil as it grows. And that is a feature of this family of plants. They contain bacteria in their root nodules that take nitrogen and turn it into aminos. And they're not the only plants that contain this type of setup, but they are very prolific at it. They're very prolific nitrogen fixers. And so when they bring that nitrogen in from the air and turn it into a form that's usable to multicellular forms of life, they turn it into amino acids, turn it into the amino acids into proteins. But then when foraging animals eat those amino acids, they get broken back down into amino acids and reassembled into different proteins. But none of us are capable of taking the nitrogen out of the air and turning that into protein. So you need nitrogen fixing bacteria and you need nitrogen fixing plants to do that. So these enrich the soil and allow the soil to grow more protein rich foods. If you want to grow food that provides protein, whether it's animal food, plant food, or whatever, there needs to be a source of aminos. There needs to be a source of nitrogen in the soil that the plants can utilize. People call this fixed nitrogen. It needs to be nitrogen in a form that is absorbable and usable to the plants. And so a lot of that in our food system begins with plants in this family. So red clover is grown for that purpose, mainly as something that just animals would eat while it's out in the field. There's another plant called alfalfa or lucerne, depending on where you live. Medicago is its Latin name. And Medicago is usually harvested and dried and fed to animals later on as hay. So that it's a very common feed additive for grazing animals, for livestock. And to some extent, it is used as a human food as well. Sprouts, especially, there have been some experimental foods that have, ground up alfalfa and put it into flours and things like that. And that's kind of a matter of acquired taste, but it is definitely edible. So the ability to fix nitrogen and containing proteins and nitrogens is a major feature of this family of plants and a major role that this family of plants has played in human culture. And so just about everywhere that you have people who are not purely nomadic, you'll have people growing these types of plants, plants in this family. And that would, here in North America, Phaseolus is a species that occurs wild here, is a genus that occurs wild here that has been domesticated into a lot of different kinds of beans. And it does occur as a wild plant, and it is also the ancestor plant of pinto beans, Anasazi beans, Great Northern beans, lots of different types of beans. And those are all lima beans, I think. Also, they're all they've been part of the traditional agriculture of people in this part of the world for a long time, often in combination with corn and squash. And all three of those plants are things that can be kept for a long time after you've picked them. You can keep a winter squash for months. You can keep dry beans or dry corn for years. So, I mean, you can dry squash and keep it even longer too, but just, if you just have a winter squash, you can keep it over the winter and cook it anytime during the winter, and it'll still be good. So these are plants that are able to produce a lot of food, but they rely on each other, and they especially rely on the beans to grow and fix the soil and nourish and enrich the soil. If you're growing plants in summer, depending on what kind you're growing, if you're growing corn and beans and squash together, the beans will grow first. At least they'll come to fruit first. And so they're kind of their life cycle is foundational to the life cycle of the others. And it's helping to keep the soil from getting depleted. If you just try and grow corn by itself over and over in the same spot, you won't get very good results after the first year or two. But if you grow with beans, or if you alternate back and forth between corn and beans in different small spots within a garden, then you can get good soil consistently and good yields consistently. So that nitrogen fixing and the fact that it is a storable form of food, the fact that the seeds become hard and become a storable form of food in most varieties of beans is something that that has played a big role in why it's become such a popular family of staple crops. It lasts, and it's a form of carbohydrates and protein. Hang on just a moment. I have to respond to a message someone sent me. Sorry for the interruption. So where was I? Right. So the protein is one of the things that you often find in this family of plants. Um, Another thing that you often find in this family of plants is that they contain certain polysaccharides, certain gum type substances that have been used for a variety of things, including as filler, as binders and emulsifiers. So for instance, if you've ever opened a can of beans and you pour out the liquid, you know it's slimy. And this is called aquafaba, especially when it's made from garbanzo beans that you canned at home. And sometimes people use this as a thickener. It can thicken soups and things like that. It also does tend to produce more gas than the rest of the beans because the stuff that it is made out of, the starches that it's made out of, are not broken down into sugars by your saliva the way that the starch in wheat or a lot of grains are. So the amylase in your mouth does not break these longer starches down into simple carbohydrates that can be used for energy. Instead, it passes on through your gut and gets into your intestinal flora, who then can break it down. So it tends to produce an increase in the population of gut bacteria. Be they good gut bacteria or bad gut bacteria, for the most part, it will tend to increase their population. So if you have good gut bacteria in general and you take this, it may cause some gassiness, but it will also help to promote the populations of those bacteria. So people have taken it after taken not only aquafaba, but also thin soups made of lentils or other beans as a convalescent food after they've been ill, especially after a diarrheal illness, because it's a very absorbable, digestible kind of food that contains protein, and also it helps to put back the gut bacteria that you may have lost from either not eating or from having a lot of diarrhea, or alternately from having taken antibiotics. And so that's something that people have used a variety of different variations on that, whether it's lentil soup or thin garbanzo bean paste, or a whole different thing. They call them pulses, various different names for this type of thing. But often that with some different spices in it is a traditional way of delivering medicine and nutrition to someone, especially someone who can't tolerate a lot of who can't eat very much yet, people who are just starting to regain their strength after an illness. Gums that are found in the beans, or gums that exude from the bark or stems of plants in the bean family, are also used in similar ways. And sometimes these types of gums, let's see, I don't think I have any of them here with me in the clinic, but some examples would be acacia gum, locust bean gum, and tragacanth gum. Tragacanth comes from a plant in the Astragalus genus. Acacia gum comes from an acacia plant and from the stem, and locust bean comes from the bean of a locust tree. So these are all similar substances made out of mostly a bunch of medium to long chain carbohydrates. And when they're dry, they look transparent, crystalline, yellowish to reddish color in little drops. And then if you grind them up into powder, they're just sort of a yellowish white color. But if you soak them in water, they turn into this blobby gelatinous substance. And if you mix that with powdered herbs, if you mix even, you can thin it way out and mix just a tiny bit of it with a little bit of powdered herbs, just enough to get the powder damp. Then you can make tablets or pastilles. Pastilles are made by rolling. So it makes a sort of dough out of the powdered herbs. Then you can either roll them into little balls, which are called pastilles, or you can press them in a mold that has some little scooped out spaces in it into tablets. And so in that case, it would be what's called an excipient or a binder. It's something that's holding the powder together to make something that can be swallowed all at once. And then once it has been swallowed, the gum gradually breaks apart and releases the medicine. So this is, there are many different recipes for how to go about that. But if you have some tragacanth gum or any kind of gum will work for this. I often use gum from cherry trees, which are not in this family. But locust bean gum is something that's commercially available too, as is tragacanth gum, as is acacia gum. Acacia, yeah. Sometimes people call it gum arabic. Benzoin gum is the sap of a different type of tree that's not related to this. It's an aromatic, fragrant sap from a tree, more along the lines of what myrrh or frankincense are like, but these are pretty much unscented, the ones from the bean plants. And you don't need very much of it. For example, if you have just a teaspoonful, just a few grams of powdered bean gum, you can soak that in a few ounces of water, 4 ounces of water or so, and it will thicken the whole thing. You have to let it sit for a long time, overnight, maybe even over 2 nights. I would often sit it overnight and then put it in the fridge and let it sit over a second night because I don't want it to ferment, but I also don't want it to still be little bits of gum. I want it to just kind of dissolve into the water and thicken the water. And then you can mix that with a pretty large quantity of herbs. Oh, no problem. Glad you could join. We're talking about the bean family and different plants in the bean family and what they have in common. So then the question of, yeah, benzoin gum can be used as a binder, but it has other properties like anti-inflammatory and anti-infective properties that are, less neutral, whereas the bean gums are just kind of like, besides doing the thing that I mentioned with the gut bacteria where they help to feed and proliferate the gut bacteria, they're not going to have a whole lot of medicinal effect of their own. So they're not going to change the medicine of the formula. So let's see if I can find here another piece of media that I might share with you about this. I can't seem to be able to find what I was looking for. One thing that I like to do is a combination of equal parts of black pepper, long pepper, which is a closely related plant to black pepper, and powdered ginger, and mix that powder together. And then it can either be mixed with honey, which can be taken on a spoon, or it can be mixed with a little bit of bean gum and rolled into to pastilles, into little pills. And that is a decongestant, a spicy decongestant. Here's a picture of the conventional garlic plant. And this kind of shows you, this is from Kohler's Medicinal Plants, which is a German, very deeply illustrated old German herbal. So it's got kind of all the different parts laid out here, including number 2. You can see a side cutaway view of what each of the individual flowers look like. And then you've got your compound leaves there. And then you've got the bean, and then a cutaway of how the individual beans attach to the inside of the bean pod. And all of that's very typical of plants in this family. And if you look at number 2 up here of this flower, you can see that it has multiple different places in there. Each of those little dots turns into a different seed. So this is the pistil, and each of the pollen grains is going to fertilize one of these seeds. So that is a way that a lot of members of this plant family are used as a binder and an excipient. And that's something that, that's a lot of the plants that in the bean family that are used that way are from Southwest Asia and Northern Africa and the Mediterranean. And that's an area whose medicine has been really influential on the world's medicine. But even outside of that area, there are some plants that have traditionally been used like that, like the locust beans, which grow here, can also be used that way and have also been used that way. But they've never been as commercially popular as some of the ones from the Mediterranean and surrounding areas. So those are some of the a few of the things that make this plant family, that give this plant family a lot of relationship with people and with cultures, as far as being food, being medicine, being an excipient, being a feed for animals, and a way of enriching the soil. Another thing that I want to talk about that comes up a lot in modern plant medicine is the use of these plants to support and modify the endocrine system. So this is a drawing that I made, kind of a cutesy little drawing of soybean plant. And a soybean plant, like the clover plant, has compound leaves made up of 3 leaflets. And here in the United States, soy is one of the most widely cultivated crops when you consider the number of acres or square miles or whatever that are being plowed and planted. Soy accounts for a huge portion of that. And a lot of that is used for food for people, and some of it is used for food for animals, and a lot of it is used for enriching the soil as well. There are a class of substances that occur in most members of the bean family, maybe all members of the bean family, really, but that the bean family has become really well known for since people started learning about chemistry. And these are called isoflavones. And you can see that I've drawn them as though they were the beans inside of a bean pod, just for kind of artistic effect. But these are substances that consist of two hexagonal rings of carbon atoms attached to a third that is not sharing members with them. So in other words, it's not like it doesn't share a side with any of them. It's attached by this little bridge here. But it has three hexagonal carbon atoms, two of which share a side. And that's what the structure of an isoflavone is. And then exactly where the oxygens and the H's and the OH, the O's and the OH's are on the outside of it, determine which isoflavone it is. So this one is called genistein and is probably the most well-researched one, closely followed by daidzein, which sometimes you will see these called soy isoflavones, sometimes just isoflavones, especially if they're not from soy. Red clover contains lots of them as well and is also used as a commercial source for supplements. Sometimes people call them phytoestrogens. And phytoestrogen kind of gives away what they do in the human body to some extent, but it's also sort of a misnomer because they're not really structurally the same as an estrogen molecule. If it were an estrogen molecule, all three of those little rings would be attached to each other, and the third one would have, there would be also a, one of them would be sort of a pentagon shape. An additional one would be sort of pentagon shape. So they're kind of close enough in shape to estrogens, which people talk about estrogen as though it were a single substance, but it's really more correct to talk about estrogens, which are a class of substances, a class of hormones in the human body and in other creatures' bodies as well. But there are many different kinds of estrogen, three big ones that people pay a lot of attention to: estrone, estriol, and estradiol. And all of them attach to the same receptor sites, but when they attach to the same receptor sites, there's a big difference in how powerfully they cause that receptor site to react. So estradiol is a much more powerful estrogen than estriol, which is somewhat more powerful than estrone, for instance. And all of them are much, much more powerful than genistein and daidzein. So these, you could think of them as acting in the body as though they were very, very weak estrogens. Hold on just a moment. All right. So yes, you can think of these as being very, very weak estrogens. So in a person who is very deficient in estrogen, a person, or deficient might not even be the right word, in a person who does not have very much estrogen, the presence of these very weak estrogens will actually increase the total estrogen activity in their body. And in someone who has a lot of estrogen, this very weak estrogen, will get in the way of the stronger estrogens and keep them from being able to attach to the receptor sites because it will be taking up some of them. So in a person with very high estrogen, it will tend to bring down the total estrogen activity in the body. And in a person with very low estrogen, it will tend to bring up the total estrogen activity in the body. So we could call this, in herbal medicine, sometimes we would describe an herb that works in this kind of both directions as being amphoteric. This is named after Amphotera, which is like a vase with a handle on each side. A little more jargony and little more specific way of describing this would be to say that it's a partial agonist antagonist for estrogen. Partial agonist means that it weakly promotes the activity of the substance, of the other substance, in this case estrogen, by attaching to its receptor sites. Antagonist means that it gets in the way of it and keeps it from doing its job. So you just imagine if you were doing some kind of a job, and then maybe you had a small child with you and they want to help, so they kind of start doing the job, and then you can't do it because they're trying to do it, but they're doing it really slowly. That's kind of the nature of a partial agonist antagonist relationship. They're trying to help, but they're not very good at it, so they might be decreasing the total amount that's getting done, unless you're just not trying to do the job right then, in which case they're increasing the total amount that's getting done by their little contribution. So that is the kind of nature of that relationship, which comes up not only in this case, but in a lot of cases. A substance will be a partial agonist antagonist to another substance. Another good example would be chamomile and Valium. They attach to the same receptor site. One of them is a lot stronger than the other and can kind of do the same job, but also gets in the way of the other one if it happens to be present. So a lot of people have made a lot of use of isoflavones for this kind of purpose. As people's estrogen levels decline as they age, that can cause a lot of changes in how people feel, and those changes are really different from one person to the next. And some people don't really have a lot of very obvious changes for themselves as far as how they're feeling on a day-to-day basis, and some people do. Some people have hot flashes, night sweats, changes in periods, changes in bone density, which is a more of a long-term thing. And some people don't really experience as much of that at all. But if someone is experiencing that kind of thing, then taking some isoflavones can really take the edge off of any sort of discomfort that those changes are bringing about, and kind of not really, it doesn't really have the same effect on the body as taking exogenous estrogen would, because it's not really prolonging the body's total, what people call estrogen window, which is like the length of lifetime that someone's body is having high levels of estrogen. Typically, that's kind of thought of as being from when people start having periods to when they stop. But that's different for different people. It can be, I mean, the number of years that is different for different people, but also exactly what someone's estrogen level might look like in those periods of time can be very different too. So it's kind of an imprecise terminology. But my point being that taking isoflavones is not really the same thing as taking estrogen from an outside source, because they're chemically pretty different, but it can have some of the same positive clinical outcomes in terms of reducing menopausal type symptoms, and also maybe making people feel more energetic, maybe making people feel more libido, It might help with bone health, but I don't really feel like we necessarily have the data to show that it absolutely does. If it is being used with a view towards trying to preserve and maintain bone health, it should only be part of what's being done, because there's other things like weight-bearing exercise and nutrition that are really important for that as well. So this is something that soy and red clover are two big commercial sources for isoflavones in the supplement industry, but in real life and in the rest of human culture outside of the supplement industry, there are lots and lots of sources for these things. And there's nothing special about soy except that there's already a lot of it being grown. So it's not an especially good source of isoflavones. It's just an especially common one. Hang on just a second. So, as far as the bean family goes, there are other plants that contain much larger amounts of these substances. Mung beans and lentils contain large amounts of them. There's a plant called black gram or black scurf pea that can be sometimes found. I've seen it in a grocery store that sells Indian food. It's not something you would usually find in the usual American food supply, but it is something that if you look for, you can find. And this is something that actually contains maybe 100 times as much of the isoflavones as soy does. And also, with pretty much all of these plants, all of them as far as I know, if they're sprouted, the amount of isoflavones in them increases dramatically just as they're beginning to sprout. Bean sprouts, alfalfa sprouts, sprouted red clover, sprouted mung beans all contain very large amounts of these things. It is possible to get too much of these substances. Sometimes that can look like changes in libido. I've seen one person that started lactating after they were drinking like a liter a day of red clover tea for a while. And that's pretty, someone who'd never had children or lactated before just kind of spontaneously started. And we're worried that something might be badly wrong, but it was just that they were drinking a lot of red clover tea, and it was just changing how their endocrine system was doing things in a kind of an unpredictable way, because normally you would associate that not with estrogen or with a lack of estrogen, but with the presence of a hormone called prolactin. But hormones are kind of a tangled web, and sometimes when one thread gets pulled, it changes things in ways that aren't always what you would expect. Well, some people have better luck than others with legumes. But like I said, in a lot of people, legumes would not actually increase the total amount of estrogen activity in a person. They might actually decrease it. But go with if you feel this, you've tried something and it doesn't seem to do well for you, then then that's probably that's very often a reproducible result. Question of, is it possible to be allergic to your own estrogen? Not allergic, but because that would be incompatible with life. But and also, I think the estrogen molecule is kind of really the wrong sort of thing to provoke an allergenic response, because it's not a peptide, it's a steroid. But it is definitely possible for your own estrogen to trigger unpleasant experiences in your body, like inflammation and things like that. It's definitely possible for instance, estrogen to have an effect on the immune system that results in more inflammatory activity, which could be kind of similar to an allergy in some ways, which is a different type of provocation of the immune system. But it's definitely possible that more estrogen could kind of cause a dysregulated immune system to be more actively dysregulated. I'm not sure whether that would involve a spike in histamine or not, but it could definitely result in more inflammation. I really kind of wouldn't expect it to cause a spike in histamine, because usually histamine happens in response to proteins, or at least chains of amino acids, and estrogen isn't that by itself. So, but I don't know. I mean, I don't measure people's histamine. If somebody's having a response that looks like an allergic reaction, then I can say that, okay, this looks like an allergic type reaction, but I don't necessarily know for sure that there is actually an increase in their histamine level or anything, because I'm not measuring that. Yeah. So isoflavones are, a kind of a newer discovery, but a lot of their outcomes, a lot of their things that they do clinically are traditional. They kind of demonstrate some of the mechanism of action behind clinical experiences that people have been aware of for a long time, even though we weren't aware of the substances themselves until more recently. So earlier I mentioned licorice. This is licorice, and there we go. This is some extract of licorice, and licorice is the root of a plant in the bean family. The licorice flavor is from a substance called glycyrrhizin, and it's a very, very sweet tasting substance. By itself, it's probably 100 times sweeter than sugar in terms of how much of it takes to make something taste sweet. It takes very, very small amounts of it compared to what it would take of sugar. And there are a few species of it, but the Glycyrrhiza glabra is the usual one for people to be familiar with. There is also a product called deglycerinated licorice root, or DGL, which has been the subject of some clinical trials for upset stomach. licorice is traditionally used for upset stomach, but the thing about licorice is, and about glycyrrhizin specifically in the licorice, is that it causes the body to spill potassium. In other words, it causes the kidneys to remove potassium from the bloodstream. Not super dramatically or anything, but enough that if someone is prone towards higher blood pressure and they take licorice root for a while, it will tend to make their blood pressure go up because their kidneys are getting rid of too much potassium. Potassium sort of balances out the effects of sodium. You have to have just the right ratio of sodium and potassium to help conduct electricity in your body, or else your heart beats too hard and it increases your blood pressure. And also, not only does your heart beat too hard, but your arteries get tight. The lining around your arteries tenses up. And so that's why people took the glycyrrhizin out of licorice, is because they wanted to be able to use it for upset stomach, but without having the thing where if you take it for a few weeks, it messes with your blood pressure. So this is something that in my practice, I just use it straight. And if somebody has an upset stomach for weeks at a time, then something else is going on that I need to address. You know, it's not something, I don't believe in giving somebody a purely symptomatic treatment for weeks and weeks at a time, unless I just don't have any other choice about it. And usually with an upset stomach, there's something going on that you can address. Often it's constipation, but not always. So I don't really use DGL, but it is a popular supplement that people buy. And in traditional Chinese medicine, often I think that the effect on the kidneys that licorice has is more the point of what they're trying to get to happen. So in a lot of traditional Chinese medicines and a lot of the Chinese understanding of licorice, it's actually being used to influence the endocrine system. Hang on a second. I want to get Bensky and Gamble's Materia Medica from the other room and read what it has to say about it. I'm working on turning my waiting room into a reading room. I feel like I don't really like to have people waiting around for treatment anyway, especially not the way that waiting rooms have often been done in the past in clinics, not in my clinic, but in other clinics, is that you have a bunch of people sitting around waiting for a really long time, and some of those people are very medically fragile, and some of them are contagiously ill, and they're sitting in the same room breathing the same air, and I just think that that's negligent. So I always try to arrange my practice so that most of the time when someone gets here, the person before them has already left. And that's better for privacy, and it's better for not passing the disease from one person to another. So that's always the way that I've tried to do things. And so having a waiting room under those circumstances, it's often just empty. Usually when somebody gets here, I have them come straight back. So I'm trying to better utilize that space. So this is about the herb Glycyrrhiza urulensis, which is Chinese licorice, and here's a picture of it. It's called gan cao in Chinese. Gan meaning sweet, and cao meaning herb, grass. And there's a drawing of it. So that is a different species of licorice than what grows in Western Europe. Okay, sorry about that. So when it talks about the actions of this herb, it says that it enters all 12 meridians, meaning that it works on all the organs of the body. It has an effect throughout the entire body. And so some of the things that it's used for are actually things that are kind of more associated with the kidney and the way that the kidney regulates electrolytes and dampness and things like that in the body. So it says that it moderates spasms and alleviates pain for painful spasms of the abdomen or leg. So for cramps and things like that. It says it's used as an antidote for a variety of toxic substances. That it's used, the sweetness of it is used to harmonize the characteristics of other herbs. In other words, it's used in formulas because of its sweetness, helping to kind of bind together some of what the other herbs are doing. This is Radix glycyrrhiza urulensis ganzhao, clearly increases both the duration and strength of the effects of cortisone. So it's having an effect on the endocrine system there. It says that let's see, use for diabetes insipidus, which is kind of has to do with how the body is handling fluids. It has an anti-inflammatory effect. It's used for the treatment of chronic bronchial asthma. It has its gastrointestinal effects, much like it does with Glycyrrhiza glabra in other traditions of medicine. And it's used for detoxifying, reduces the toxic effects of many substances, and that it's used in combinations in formulas with other herbs to sort of increase the effects of more androgenic type hormones in the body. So it's working on a series of chemical reactions in the body called the renin angiotensin aldosterone complex, which are a whole series of different interactions in the body where that are involved in blood pressure and heart function and digestion and hormone production, steroid production in the body. Yeah, it can help with hormonal imbalances. And I've been using it a lot to help people whose systems have become dysregulated after having had COVID, to sort of support the endocrine systems of people who are experiencing a lot of fatigue and various other issues after having had COVID. I had used it some for that previously with Epstein-Barr, for people who had Epstein-Barr. And because of the way COVID enters the cell, it's interacting with the same renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. And I feel that my suspicion is that licorice kind of helps to push that a little bit back towards normal, back towards where it should be. And so that is something that I've been using it for really since fairly early on in the pandemic, which is getting close to, not quite 4 years yet, but 3.5 years or so. The licorice has been a pretty key point of my strategy for helping people's bodies return to normal. And I've worked with many hundreds of people directly, and I've done a lot of teaching other herbalists how to do it as well, and they have in turn worked with lots and lots more people. So that's something to keep in mind if you encounter that type of a situation. So I have the here is an extract of red clover, and then I have the licorice there. Here in the clinic, I also have senna. This is let's see. This is a tincture made of senna pods. Senna marilandica, which is a native senna plant here. And here are its beans. Just a cute little bean. And then inside the bean pod, rather as you might expect, are little tiny bean seeds. A little too small to get the camera to resolve properly. But this is a plant that grows in late summer, early fall in this part of the country. And it's in open meadows, and it actually contains a different set of substances that are not uncommon in the bean family. And these are saponicides. They're soapy type substances. And in this case, they're called senicides. Senicides are kind of sweet tasting, but when they get into the guts, into the gut bacteria break them down, just kind of like what I described with some of the polysaccharides. But the smaller molecules that they break them down into are actually sort of like I said, kind of like soap. They're kind of irritating to the lining of the digestive tract. And so when people take them, it irritates the lining of the digestive tract and causes them to have diarrhea. If you take large amounts of them, they can cause a lot of cramping in the guts. They can cause a lot of discomfort. In a small amount, it's a much more gentle effect, but these are all what would be called stimulant laxatives, meaning that they stimulate the guts. They're not stimulant in the sense that caffeine is a stimulant. They just stimulate the intestines and cause them to move, rather than just being fiber laxatives that are stool softening, for instance. So this is one type of laxative that has many different substances that carry out that type of action. But the ones that are found in beans are mostly like the senicides, very similar to that. And what they do is they discourage larger grazing animals from overeating these plants, especially while they're growing. So these are very nutritious plants. Like I said, they have a lot of protein in them. They're very something that a lot of grazing animals would want to eat, but the plants don't necessarily want to be eaten. Unlike with berries and birds, where the berries are getting, are essentially being offered to the birds who then distribute the seeds. The Cynicids are trying to protect themselves from being eaten, or the plants in the bean family are often trying to protect themselves from being eaten. And there's two main ways they go about this. One of which is chemical, stuff like what I just described, where you eat too much of it, it gives you bad diarrhea, and then you don't maybe eat so much of it next time. The other is physical, which is thorns, prickly pieces. Some of them also contain bitter substances that are not necessarily laxative but are unpleasant to eat. So a lot of them contain bitter substances or laxative substances, and quite a few of them have thorns. And if you ever see the thorns on a locust tree, I'm not sure if I have here. I'll find you a picture of them. They are something else. The thorns on a locust tree can be 6 inches long, and sometimes the thorns have thorns, and sometimes the thorns have thorns of their own. And they can grow in these just tangled masses that come straight out of the branch of the trunk of the tree. So I'll find you a picture of that. Mhm. All right, so this is from the Wikipedia article on Gleditsia, which is the honey locust. There are thornless honey locusts that people grow um, as ornamentals, but this is what the plant's trunk looks like in the wild. You can see just right on the trunk there are lots of thorns, and these thorns can branch and sub-branch sometimes, and they're very stiff, they're very hard. Yeah, the flowers are edible. The flowers are like, they taste just like pea blossoms. Well, they taste a lot like peas. They taste a lot like sugar snap peas, sweet and kind of beany tasting. So people speculate that this was to keep very large animals like mastodons or something like that, woolly rhinoceroses, from rubbing up against the tree and pushing them over. You see the same sort of strategy in bean trees that grow around elephants in Africa with the acacia trees. With the acacia trees, it doesn't always work. Sometimes elephants will push them over anyway. With the locust trees, it has been quite a long time since a mastodon has pushed one of these over. So I guess it's working pretty well as far as the trees know. But yeah, these squirrels can actually navigate this. They can climb up this, or they can usually find a way to get around the thorns and get up the tree. But larger animals cannot. Even things that normally climb trees like raccoons and stuff like that, they can't really climb through that very easily. They will tend to avoid these trees. And there used to be more beavers and things like that around here too, and it might offer some defense against them, but typically the thorns are further up on the tree. So people tend to think that it was to keep large animals from rubbing up against them and pushing them over. But anyway, it's a very impressive looking defense mechanism. And the wood of these trees is very hard, very not corrosion. We don't use that term for wood. It doesn't rot easily. So it's very weather resistant. And these trees are very beloved of insects, and they produce a lot of nectar because they have these just clusters of very nectar-rich, sweet-smelling, bright white flowers that you can see because they're way up a tree. You can see them a mile away. So they're very attractive to pollinators, and even to some extent to browsing animals that might be able to reach some of the lower branches. You know, if a deer's, I don't know if you know this about deer, they can stand on their hind legs, and when they do, they're really tall. And they can walk around like that if they want to. They don't usually choose to, but they can. And I've seen them stand up and munch things like grapes or flowers like this that were hanging down. So they can do that, and hummingbirds, sapsuckers, various other creatures will come to them for their sweet nectar, and ants. So the honey locust is it's a really nice tree. It's something that will often grow. It will often be one of the early big trees to grow back in an area. Another tree in the bean family around here that you might see soon, or that you might see it any day, but that will be in flower relatively soon, is the redbud tree. And the redbud tree has pink buds and flowers that bloom before the tree leaves out, and that are very visible in the early spring, Easter time-ish spring woods. And you can see them from far away through the other trees. And a neat thing about them is that they will actually produce flowers right on the trunk of the tree, not just out on the ends of the branches, not even just on the branches, but even right on the trunk of the tree, there will be a flower growing right out of the middle of the trunk. And those will turn into beans, and you'll have beans growing right out of the trunk of a tree. So the redbud tree is not unique, but somewhat unusual for the bean family for having simple leaves. It has a big heart-shaped leaf instead of having a compound leaf. Kudzu is another plant in the bean family. It is not native to this area. It was brought in for erosion control in the 60s or so, maybe a little earlier than that, before my time, but fairly early on, within the time that it was introduced to a lot of areas in the American South, it grew very prolifically. And so you'd have a situation where, for instance, when they built the railroad, they cut through the side of a mountain, and you'd have cliffs that were straight up and down, and people planted kudzu along there to kind of keep it hopefully hold the ground together so it doesn't slide down onto the tracks. And the kudzu overgrew those areas very quickly. And there was sort of an idea that kudzu would become much more invasive than it ended up being, because it grows so prolifically where it's planted and takes over large areas and shades out everything else in those areas. But it's not really good at getting itself beyond those initial areas. So, for instance, I can remember going by a particular place on Highway 11 in Powell County, just past Natural Bridge State Park, where there was an area where a house and some trees, some dead trees and some telephone poles and a house were all just covered with kudzu. And I remember seeing this, back in the late 70s, early 80s, and thinking, wow, that is just really taking over. I wonder what that's going to look like in a few more years. But now, 40 something years later, it looks the same as it did then. I mean, the structure that was there has kind of crumbled to the ground, but the size of the stand of kudzu is basically stable compared to what it was decades ago. So even though it overgrew that area that it was planted in fairly quickly, it didn't really continue spreading beyond that very much. And that has been the case in most places where kudzu was introduced. Yeah, it does. It will kill trees. It will shade out things that it grows over, and it does do better in Atlanta than it does here. But it is not. It's not as successful at starting new stands of itself as people initially feared that it was going to be. But yeah, it does. It does definitely do a lot better. Georgia, I think, was where it was originally introduced, and it's kind of well, they have less freeze there, less winter there than we have here in Kentucky. And that probably helps to control it to some extent too. Although in its native habitat, it's not a tropical plant. It grows in Japan, and it's that's a fairly, I mean, that's further north than we are by a lot. And but when it was introduced here, it did initially take off, but there are a lot of other plants that have become much more invasive than it was. For example, winter creeper, euonymus, is a very common invasive plant that you will find all over Lexington. And it's not, it didn't have the dramatic onset that kudzu did, so it didn't get quite the reputation early on. But now it's everywhere and it's hard to get rid of. So kudzu is a member of this family as well. The isoflavones in kudzu are similar to the isoflavones in other bean plants. The starch in kudzu is a little different. It produces a very starchy root, and rather than producing its polysaccharides in a gum form, it's actually like a white powdery starch. And one kudzu root can be really large because the kudzu plant can get really big. It can be, 100 feet long, couple 100 feet long vine, but the root can be, tens of pounds. And the starch that is sort of beaten out of that root and then hardened is called kuzu. And it can be used as a thickener. It's kind of like, it has some of the similar properties to what I described for the gums, but the texture of it's a bit different. And it also has the interesting property of interfering with how people process alcohol. And some people have talked about using it as a deterrent for people drinking alcohol, because when someone takes kuzu root starch, if they drink alcohol, it makes it so that they kind of get hungover while they're drinking instead of getting drunk. Ginkgo does the same sort of thing, ginkgo nuts. But the trouble with that approach is that people usually won't do it. So if someone's going to drink, they're just going to not take the kuzu. So but it does have some limited utility in helping people to avoid alcohol, and some history of use for that. Mostly when I've used it as a thickener though, and a little, it's less binding than some of the other gums that I talked about. But it's very thickening. It takes very little of it. If you wanted to add some to the soup to change the texture and make it thicker, it doesn't take very much at all. But it's also expensive compared to other starches because of the labor of foraging it and purifying the starch from it. All right. Yeah, the other genus of plants I wanted to talk about in the bean family real quick is Astragalus. And Astragalus membranaceus is the main astragalus that's used in herbal medicine, and it's a bitter plant. Astragaluses have a milky sap to them. Um, there are some astragaluses that are native to the United States. I haven't really messed with them very much. They're somewhat toxic. The above ground parts of the plants are. Livestock that eat them kind of get staggery, and it makes them act weird. So it probably has some psychoactive effects. People call it loco weed, but the Astragalus membranaceus is not really stimulating or sedating to the brain. It is very bitter. The root's the main part used, and it traditionally. So if you read about it in Western herbal medicine texts, it'll often talk about it in terms of boosting the immune system, making immunity stronger. Because this is an herb that comes into Western medicine by way of traditional Chinese medicine, wanted to kind of get that perspective a little bit for you as well. And you can kind of compare it. Of course, you know, the word immune system, the term immune system isn't really is a fairly new concept. Not that the things that the immune system does are new concepts, but the idea of grouping certain functions of the body together as an immune system is sort of a newer way of looking at things. Um, find this. All right, just. So this is their description. Bensky and Gamble's description of it is that it tonifies the spleen and augments the qi for lack of appetite and fatigue and diarrhea. It says that it raises the yang qi of the spleen. So the spleen is kind of involved in the lymph system and the immune system, but it is, you know, kind of more a palpable organ. You can tell when the spleen is enlarged, when the spleen is doing something, whereas you wouldn't be able to tell that the lymphocytes coming from the spleen were doing something unless you had a microscope. So it tonifies the qi. And so this was used for postpartum fever and recovery stage of severe loss of blood. So this is something that its use is kind of similar to ginseng in some ways, in that it's like helping the body to regain energy, and it's helping the spleen. It's helping to replenish the body's systems after being depleted from something like having a baby or losing a lot of blood. It reduces edema and promotes urination. So that's something where it's going to be, you know, removing fluid from the system, and promotes the discharge of pus. So that is kind of something that's going on with the immune system too. If there's infection, it's going to help to purge out that infection. So it's good for non-healing wounds, especially. It says inappropriate circumstances for wasting and thirsting disorder, which is basically diabetes, numbness of the limbs, and painful obstruction. So that's all kind of things that have to do with the helping the kidneys to remove fluid from the body. So, you know, the way that it's considered to work here in traditional Chinese medicine is a different paradigm, a different way of describing things. But they would consider mainly things that help with the spleen chi, the energy of the spleen, and then to some extent also the lungs and the kidneys. So, kind of a different way of looking at it, but it helps with energy in the body. It helps with infection, and it helps to replenish the system after an illness. So that's something that is a different set of substances that are found in many plants in the bean family are found in astragalus, and that would be the milky sap and the bitter principles that are found in it, which are a little bit different than the gummy stuff that's found in locust trees, or a little bit different again from the senicides that are found in senna. But chemically, these are all somewhat related sets of substances. They're not necessarily any of them like a pure single chemical, but they're all things that involve polysaccharides and organic acids. So, a lot of overlap amongst what substances are produced by the bean family and what humans have used them for. So this is another family that, like the last two that we talked about, that contains a lot of plants that are of cultural significance to humans as forage crops, as food and cash crops, and as medicines for people. And once you learn to recognize what a bean flower looks like, you'll be able to recognize it every time you see it. And once you get familiar with them as a family, it will help you to understand the individual herbs in that family better. And so that's why I'm going through these large families, these plant families that have a lot of different medicinal herbs in them, and just kind of trying to familiarize you with the features of those families, so that instead of understanding each herb in isolation when you come upon them in the real world or in texts, you will be able to understand them as part of a system and part of how they fit into a larger whole. All right. Any questions about any of that? All right. Well, I think next time we are going to be talking about the mint family, which contains a whole bunch more interesting medicinal plants. Thanks for coming, and I will talk to you again soon.